Okay, we will go ahead and start just to make sure we leave as much time as possible for the webinar itself. So welcome. This webinar on a new era in U.S. policy toward Myanmar is jointly sponsored by the SUNY-CUNY Southeast Asia Consortia and the Stanford Southeast Asia Program. I'm Meredith Weiss. I'm the director of the SUNY-CUNY SEAC and Li Kuang Chen Fellow with Stanford's Asia Pacific Research Center, where the SEAC is located. And so I'll start with just a few points before I introduce the speakers. So first, I would ask that everyone who is in attendance, please treat this webinar as under Chatham House rules. I realize it's difficult for us to enforce that for a webinar, so I simply ask your goodwill in doing so. So what that means is that you may cite or otherwise use the information that you learn here, but please without revealing the identity or affiliation of the speakers on the panel. That is, these presentations, these remarks are not for attribution. We will have plenty of time for questions and answers after the initial remarks by each of the speakers. So please use the Q&A feature on Zoom for that. You may post questions anonymously or identify yourself. And if your question is directed toward a particular panelist, please indicate that in the question. And I apologize if we can't get to all, so don't wait till the last moment to post your question. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and available online, but you will need to request a password to access it. Just a quick announcement also of an ICES seminar next week. So on the 17th of March from 10 to 11:30 a.m. Singapore time. That's on Myanmar's humanitarian future in 2025, questions and concerns, featuring Mary Callahan, Rosalind Zahal, and Surachani Sriyai. If you are interested in this panel, you may be interested in that one as well. And so that's available on the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore website. So just a few remarks before we get started, just to set the stage. So even before the beginning of this new US administration in January 2025, the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, described Myanmar as enduring profound polycrisis, so political, social, economic, and environmental challenges. About half the population is now below the poverty line, and another third is just barely above. Inflation is over 25%, and the currency has lost over 70% of its value. Less than half the population now has access to electricity. 16% of rice-growing areas have been lost to conflict or flooding since the coup alone, with the cost of inputs further depressing productivity and heightening food insecurity. And not only is forced conscription taking people out of other possible social and economic roles, but also forcing people into exile, but also there are ongoing attacks on civilians and increasing numbers of airstrikes and mass killings. That all amounts to about 90% of the Myanmar populations having been exposed to political violence since the coup in 2021. There has also been, unsurprisingly, substantial deterioration in healthcare access and public health outreach and monitoring. So since the time of that report, the freezing or cancellation of USAID-supported programs has further worsened healthcare access, including reproductive healthcare specifically, as well as imperiling support for exiled media, for political prisoners, everything from care packages to safe houses across the border, for victims of trafficking and domestic violence, and more. It is not clear, as we'll hear in the presentations to come, if there are other programs or donors that can or will step up to fill that gap. The US has been by far the largest donor state, and the problems are very complex. So the US provided over $237 million in 2024, including over 31% of humanitarian assistance overall for Myanmar. That was projected to be $259 million in 2025, before the sudden plunge to under $5 million now. There have been near immediate effects to health clinics and other services, both within Myanmar and along the Thai-Myanmar border. So the panelists today will tell us more about this aspect of the current crisis, but will offer also a broader context. I'll introduce all four panelists first, and then we'll hear from each of them in turn before turning to Q&A. So first, we'll hear from Professor Alice Baugh, who is the Emma Smith Morris Professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. She will address the extent and nature of US involvement in Myanmar and on the Thai-Myanmar border. Next, we'll hear from Scott Marcial, who's former US ambassador to Myanmar, Indonesia, and for ASEAN Affairs. He is also a visiting scholar and practitioner fellow on Southeast Asia at Stanford University. And he will discuss the effects of the seemingly dramatic shift in foreign policy and assistance and what we think we know about this new US administration's overall policy toward Myanmar. We'll turn next to Chawtet Ong, who's the head of the Conflict, Peace, and Security Program at Myanmar's Institute for Strategy and Policy, currently based in Chiang Mai. He will speak to why Myanmar is so key in geopolitical and security terms, such that it really should remain a priority. And then last but not least, we will hear from Sumon Tazin Ong, who's a visiting fellow in the Myanmar Studies program at the ICC Sof Ishak Institute, as well as adjunct assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. She will address the implications for Myanmar and its people of the sudden cessation of USAID funding and other support. Each will speak for about 10 or 12 minutes, and then we'll turn to Q&A. And again, please remember, comments are not for attribution, and please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. So first, Alice.
Hey, hi. Thanks, Meredith. So, as Meredith explained, I'm actually going to do a little bit of stage setting in terms of U.S. priorities, concerns, and activities in Myanmar. And I'm going to basically try to do three things. Maybe situate Myanmar in the broader context of U.S. Southeast Asian engagement, and then give a snapshot of some of the types of activities it's been supporting and its relative importance, as well as say something about the mix of actors in Myanmar and on the U.S. side. I should say that this is a little bit awkward, given that I'm followed by Scott Marcel, who has been at the forefront and in the thick of things in terms of U.S. policy. But the advantage here of going first is that he can correct whatever I've gotten wrong. So on the first point, on the broader context of U.S. Southeast Asia policy, overall, in my view, Myanmar has been a tough issue for the United States, given its mix of strategic, economic, and political objectives. In Southeast Asia, I might put the United States' broader objectives into four buckets, right? I mean, one, non-traditional security challenges, not like transnational crime, human trafficking, health. And, as Meredith has already suggested, these challenges have gotten worse. As one example, in a span of about 3 years, opium production in Myanmar has doubled. And according to several sources last month, the country is now the world's largest source of opium production, as well as a major source of meth and cyber scam operations. U.S. Department of State ranks it Tier 3, the worst offending category in terms of human trafficking. And then there's also the health crisis, right? I mean, as Meredith suggested, HIV rates are up. Malaria, TB have increased as much as 7 times between 2020 and 2022. U.S. bucket number 2, right? Human rights and democratization objectives. U.S. interest, it has been in the establishment of a stable, inclusive, and democratic Myanmar government. Myanmar was the top Indo-Pacific recipient of funds directed at activities under the democracy, human rights, and governance funding category. And these, concerns, of course, sit alongside more conventional, strategic objectives, like countering China's influence strategically and economically. And even more than that, if we look back to the 2022 strategy under Biden, the U.S. objective was, to be even the quote partner of choice. And then finally, the last bucket I would include is actually working with ASEAN. And so while the primary mode of U.S. Southeast Asian engagement has been bilateral, as is its preferred mode of foreign assistance, the U.S. nevertheless has an interest in being seen as a partner that is able to work with ASEAN. And, getting the balance right on all these has not been easy. And that's because, these are not mutually exclusive objectives. Myanmar is especially illustrative of the intersection among them. So, for example, in the case of Myanmar, with the exception of a very brief period of just over 10 years, human rights and political governance concerns have driven and constrained high-level U.S. engagement. And that's reflected in both the executive and legislative branches of government. And these concerns, these human rights concerns and democratization concerns compete with strategic and geopolitical interests. And of course, the biggest concern is China and China's relative influence in Southeast Asia. One issue for the United States has been, that, punitive responses to Myanmar's deteriorating, political and humanitarian conditions, limits, of course, direct engagement, but also broader engagement, within Myanmar. And of course, punitive measures create greater need and incentive for the junta to engage other partners like China and Russia. And so certainly in the short term and medium term, this leaves the field wide for other actors to exert influence in Myanmar. And actors that include, not just U.S. geopolitical rivals, but also crime syndicates, human traffickers, and others that are more than willing to take advantage of Myanmar's desperate situation. Another U.S. challenge, as I suggested, has been how to work with ASEAN. And differences over Myanmar in earlier periods have complicated some of those relations and engagement. In recent years, I think we've seen the United States up its engagement with ASEAN as an institution, helping with institutional capacity building. And I really think that these efforts should not be minimized, even if they're in jeopardy now. As just as an example, kind of thinking about some of the differences also between the United States and ASEAN. In the U.S. 2022 strategy, the U.S. mission to ASEAN mentioned Burma 9 times, right? All the other ASEAN countries were mentioned just once, right, as part of a list of Southeast Asian countries. Right. And all but one of those 9 references to Burma in that strategy basically referred to ASEAN's unsatisfactory approach, right? It refers to ASEAN being, quote, institutionally ill-equipped, unquote, to respond to Myanmar's crisis, and, quote, the need for new approaches. We can also say that by some conventional measures, Myanmar has not been a high priority in the broader scope of U.S. foreign policy or in regional priorities either. Even with the current crisis, the tragedy of Myanmar falls well below other challenges, Ukraine and Gaza, obviously, in terms of world challenges. But it's also not Ukraine and Gaza, right? I mean, OSHA lists Myanmar number 24 in terms of the number of recipients of U.S. humanitarian assistance, with a majority of assistance going to African states as well as the Middle East. And even though Southeast Asia factors large in U.S. thinking about China, U.S. attention and priorities are devoted overwhelmingly to maritime Southeast Asia, not mainland. And so, now, on the other hand, right, a view of U.S. engagement in Myanmar from the ground up also underscores the significance of the U.S. response to Myanmar. And I'm sure others were going to say much more about this, but certainly one area that the United States has been especially significant is its support for humanitarian work and responses. Materially, humanitarian objectives dominate the U.S. objective to U.S. approach to Myanmar. Before and after the coup, the U.S. was the largest provider of humanitarian assistance. And just to get a sense of some of the U.S. priorities, about 40% of the USAID budget for Myanmar went to humanitarian relief. Other priority areas were food insecurity and sustainable economic development, which received about 20%, democratization, another 20%, and then also education and health. In short, while on the one hand, it's certainly true, as, I think media and others have highlighted, that the U.S. has lagged behind some other actors like China when it comes to development funding. It's quite a different story when it comes to, humanitarian assistance. And again, Myanmar is an especially good example because it has been one of the earliest recipients of U.S. aid, actually, since aid became a tool of U.S. foreign policy in 1950. And the significance of U.S. support is also, compounded by what the U.S. contributes to the UN and other international programs. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Food Program, UNICEF, and all of these, again, the U.S. is the largest contributor. According to OSHA's assessment last month, the UN Coordinated Humanitarian Plan on Myanmar relied on the United States for just under 30% of its overall budget. And, that's a tremendous amount to be relying on any one single actor, right? All this is to say, again, is that U.S. contributions have not just been somewhat consequential, but in fact, very consequential. Just a few points on kind of actors here. U.S. government actors and those that the U.S. is working with. U.S. agencies engaging Myanmar have been USAID, right? Of the 21 U.S. agencies that work in the foreign aid space, USAID is by far the most active and extensive in its engagement and support. In 2023, it managed an estimated 62% of U.S. foreign assistance spending. And its key arms, right? USAID's key arms have been its Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance and also its offices in neighboring countries. So, in Thailand and Bangladesh, for example. The State Department, key U.S. actor engaging Myanmar, and especially through its Bureau of Population, Refugee, and Migration, and also the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. And then we can also add here the CDC, right? As for recipients, since the coup and especially since 2022, the U.S. has really turned to what can be characterized as a localization policy, right? The idea being that assistance is being directed to local organizations. And there's really kind of three reasons for that, right? I mean, one is the thinking that localization improves the overall effectiveness of humanitarian and development assistance. The second is that localization offers the United States a way to continue supporting humanitarian objectives in the absence of government relations. A third, given U.S. limitations in terms of access, right? Logistical access is really a huge problem right now. Localization also offers a way to get around some of those access questions by relying on local actors. So again, the general approach has been to redirect, right, funding that might otherwise go to government actors or previously gone to government actors to groups that are already on the ground and working locally. And, those groups can also include, transnational NGOs, UN agencies, as well as local community groups and local civil society organizations. And again, so what all this means is that it's more than money, right? It's also about, local and regional actors and platforms. And again, this is especially important when traditional donors have withdrawn or access is overall difficult. The Relief Web reports that among humanitarian partners working in Myanmar, international NGOs, the Red Cross and the UN make up about 26% of those groups. The rest are national NGOs, civil society organizations, and community-based volunteer organizations, right? I mean, and again, that latter category has become especially more important. The localization approach and turn to local CSOs, it does still have challenges, and I just want to highlight a few that, at least one that has been flagged, right? And those challenges, have been staffing challenges at USAID, right? And that was before the executive order, right? So staffing challenges at USAID, as well as capacity limitations on the part of local organizations, right? Consequently, in some cases, as for example, the Rohingya crisis, for example, those two challenges, basically meant that only 1% of USAID's budget earmarked to respond to that crisis was actually allocated, right? So there are also challenges, right? I mean, beyond the ones that have been already highlighted. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention one other set, which is, the U.S. has also worked with groups, across the border in Thailand and Bangladesh, right? And one example of U.S. support for groups on the border is the Border Consortium, headquartered in Bangkok. That operates along the Thai-Myanmar border. It's an alliance of 9 international humanitarian non-governmental organizations from 10 countries. That consortium has been a key provider of food and support for 90,000 to 100,000 refugees on the border, living in 9 refugee camps. And about 50% of that consortium's budget is coming from the Department of State, right? So it came from the Department of State's Department of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And so, again, all this again is to say is that, U.S. U.S. Engagement, especially in the humanitarian front, has been again, quite significant. So I'm just going to end it there and turn it over to others.
Okay, thank you. And next we turn to Scott Marcial.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Alice. Alice, I think you did a really good job of, laying out the U.S. approach in recent years, and including the types of engagement and the different organizations involved. What I thought I might do is talk a little bit, sort of review since the coup, the U.S. policy under the Biden administration first, and then speculate a little bit really about Trump administration policy, and then talk a little bit about the impact. I won't focus heavily on assistance because I believe others will, but I will touch on that as well. So, first to start off, as Alice said, the U.S. really since 1988, both administrations and many in Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, have basically been pushing and so trying to support reforms that lead to a stable, uh, peaceful, hopefully somewhat prosperous or more prosperous and democratic Myanmar, in which ethnic minority communities could feel that they belonged and were treated appropriately. So it's been more of an idealistic goal, largely, than a geostrategic goal, although there's certainly geostrategic elements. And that's been always, when I was there as ambassador 2016 to 2020, it was, hoping that the reforms that had taken place and with the new NLD government could lead to further progress. So since the coup, the Biden administration condemned the coup immediately, imposed some sanctions, including, very importantly, freezing, I think, $1 billion of Myanmar money at the New York Federal Reserve, so that the military, that the junta couldn't spend that money, and has over time begun to engage, or has engaged, with national unity government and some other elements, both in the resistance and civil society, while maintaining, I guess I would say, minimal diplomatic relations. So formal official diplomatic relations with Myanmar, but really little engagement with the SAC. So in other words, was at least rhetorically very much, and in terms of diplomatic engagement, very much on the side of the people of Myanmar. But I do have to say that despite this, I don't think the Biden administration made Myanmar a priority. As Alice said, there was Ukraine, more recently Gaza, and many other issues. And people cared, but my sense was, and again, I'm speaking as a former government official, certainly couldn't speak for the Biden administration. My sense was they weren't really sure what to do, other than not liking the coup and hoping that democracy could return and wanting to support this. But pretty, I would say, a lot of rhetoric, a fair amount of assistance, as Alice has already laid out, but not as active on the diplomatic front as you might have expected, given the state of the crisis. Very cautious approach, and in fact, largely would defer to ASEAN. So despite the 2022 report sort of saying that the ASEAN way wasn't working, we saw many times Secretary of State Blinken and other senior officials saying, well, we support the 5-point consensus, which in my view was stillborn and had no chance of going anywhere, but kind of they didn't know what else to say. So they were repeating that. So I faulted them for lack of energy. They were policy was pointed in the right direction and well intended, but lacked energy and a lot of investment of resources. But as Alice pointed out, there was significant assistance, particularly on the humanitarian side, supporting refugee populations in Thailand and Bangladesh, others who were victims of conflict, a large number of displaced people, continuing as much as possible health programs and the like. I mean, I remember very much the malaria program, which, in cooperation with the Ministry of Health, when I was there, had reduced the incidence of malaria something like 80%. So very significant assistance. After the coup, the U.S. also provided some support for local governance training and these sorts of things in areas, mostly areas controlled by ethnic armed groups. We had done that before the coup, but continued that after. So there was assistance, there was rhetoric, not a huge amount of diplomacy, although there was a reasonable amount of engagement with the national unity government. Let me turn now to what I guess I would loosely describe as policy under the Trump administration. First, it's undefined. So what I'm going to say is more speculation, because senior officials have not laid out a policy on Myanmar, and in my speculation, probably haven't given it a lot of thought, to be perfectly honest. as everyone knows, they did, however, cut off most assistance to Myanmar. But that wasn't a Myanmar-specific action. That was much more targeting foreign assistance, largely for the domestic audience. So the impact on Myanmar is significant, but it wasn't brought about by, we think we should change our policy on Myanmar. It was rather, we're going to stop giving money away to people outside the United States. So very much a politically oriented decision. And it doesn't necessarily reflect what policy on Myanmar eventually will look like. I think the administration's policy to date, I mean, it's only been less than 2 months that they've been in office, but their foreign policy to date gives us some clues about what Myanmar policy might look like. And I got to say, it's not going to be pretty, because it's very clear that the relationships, the diplomacy tends to be very transactional. There seems to be little interest in maintaining or supporting alliances or doing anything to support others unless the United States gets some benefit, some tangible benefit out of it. In other words, the idealism and morality that to a certain extent drove a lot of U.S. foreign policy is so far largely absent. Um, there's so far been little discussion about supporting democracy and human rights from senior officials. Um, so my speculation is that the Myanmar crisis is going to be pretty low on the administration's priority list. Um, I suppose there's a possibility, and here I'm really speculating, that the Trump administration could decide to engage with the SAC more. Um, just because there wouldn't be the moral opposition to that there normally would be. That said, I'm not sure why they would find it in their interest to do that. Again, what benefit would the United States accrue from that? I think is how they would look at it. In theory, the concerns about Chinese influence could or should cause some more interest in Myanmar. But so far, in my view, we haven't seen nearly as much of a China focus as I would have expected. Now, that could still happen, but frankly, the administration's focused most of its criticism and negative energy on friends and allies, not on China, although China certainly has gotten some. So I guess what I'm saying is I hate to say it, but I'm not very optimistic that we're going to get a lot of attention and a lot of deep thinking about Myanmar out of this administration, at least in the near term. Things can change. Lots changes in administrations, different people come into being. So what's the impact of this U.S. pullback, not only of assistance, but of interest and diplomacy? Most obviously, the cutoff of assistance, which is dramatic, and which well, my personal opinion was done in such a way that exacerbated how harmful it would have been. In other words, you could have cut off assistance with 90 days or 180 days of notice, which at least would have given recipients some time to try to find other sources. And so cutting it off overnight was particularly problematic in my view. But again, it was done for domestic political reasons. I know that there have been some waivers reportedly granted for some types of life-saving assistance, and I understand that the Population Refugee Migration Bureau in the State Department is working through some of this, you know, what money can still come out to cover past contracts that were suddenly cut off. So there may be some money flowing, but I don't know how much, and I don't know that it would be an ongoing thing as opposed to maybe some one-off checks being sent. So, one of the questions is, what's Thailand going to do with all the Myanmar people? I mean, in addition to the people who've long lived in Thailand, with the refugees and people coming across the border or living right on the border, suddenly assistance is cut off unless other sources of assistance can be found. Not only do those refugees face serious problems, but how's the Thai government going to respond? I don't know. I would not expect out of this administration a lot of activity on the diplomatic front vis-a-vis Myanmar. There will be some in Southeast Asia, But again, judging from the first Trump administration and particularly from what we've seen so far, it will be very bilateral focused for the most part, and probably heavily transactional. Um, I don't know how much, if any, continued engagement there will be with the NUG and other actors in the resistance or civil society. We just don't know. I mean, you still don't have a lot of people in place in senior positions who might normally carry out that type of activity. Um, my guess is that beyond the obvious impact of assistance, the U.S. pullback, the biggest impact of the U.S. pullback may be psychological. Where you had a superpower that at least was rhetorically on the side of the people and against the military, and doing some engagement and a fair amount of assistance. To the extent that pulls back, I would assume that's a bit of a morale blow to people in Myanmar and perhaps to the resistance, although it's hard to measure. The last point I would make is that if Myanmar proceeds with these elections that China seems to be pushing so hard, I think based on traditional U.S. policy toward Myanmar, we would have said these are going to be a farce. They're not credible, not having anything to do with them. I don't honestly know how the Trump administration will look at them. I don't know that they'll pay a whole lot of attention one way or the other. But I think it's unlikely, at this point at least, that the U.S. would lead a major international effort to push back against those elections or to try to convince others not to applaud something that's clearly would be a farce and not legitimate. We just don't know, but I'm a little bit skeptical at this point. And so what this does is it leaves to the extent that the international community influences what happens in Myanmar, one major actor is pulling out, at least in the near term, which gives more room for the China's, Thailand's, India's, possibly ASEAN's to play a bigger role. Although, again, my view has always been that it's going to be people in Myanmar who determine where Myanmar ends up much more than outside actors. So I wish I had something hopeful and optimistic to say on the U.S. policy front, but I'm afraid I don't. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. And he will not be the only one who is not optimistic, I think. So now we will turn to Kocha.
Thank you, Professor. So let me share my screen, just.
Yes.
Okay. Can you see it? Yeah. So firstly, thank you so much for having me and also having us, and then giving this opportunity to present in this webinar. So, but before diving into the main topic, so let me highlight the very famous quote of the Farnborough prediction about Myanmar. So yeah, this is very important to keep in mind when we talk about the Myanmar geopolitical issue, especially with China and India and other, like the big power and other neighborhood country also. So he once say, after a period of the anarchy more or less prolonged, our dissident may find the Burma as a province of China. So this quote from the 1930s still reflect the Myanmar current situation today. So this is very important to keep in mind. So that's why I just want to highlight before this presentation. So, but in this presentation, I just want to highlight the full thing. Just the first one is like the context of the shift in the Myanmar evolving landscape, and also what are the major national, like the non-traditional security threat, and also the third one could be about the nature of the problem, how the politicization of the crime in the conflict setting, and also the last one could be about the geopolitical implications. So for the first one, so let me give you some, like the fact. And so this is a very quite obvious, like the Myanmar has experienced the 16,000 the armed clash between the SAC forces and the resistant group, and also SAC they carry out, like the 8,000 airstrike across the country, and also destruction is quite, like the big, the 100,000 houses and buildings burn, and also the destruction, and also almost the 8,400 civilian deaths over the past 4 years. So that these figures really reflect the current situation of the Myanmar. So since the coup, the Myanmar has experienced the profound shift, not just only the politically, but also in terms of the security and the governance. So the collapse of the state institution and like the ongoing armed conflict have created the power vacuum. So whether we like it or not, that's a reality. So it allowed the criminal network to expand their operation with a little resistance. So as a result, the regional illicit activity has started making Myanmar a keyhole for like the transnational crime. So this transnational crime existing before the coup, like in various from under the different security agency, but the post-coup instability, like has allowed them to flourish and unchecked. So today the country is, I think the Professor Alice also mentioned a lot, like the country is a major center for the drug production and the trafficking, and also particularly methamphetamine, and which like this flow markets across the Southeast Asia, not only Southeast Asia but also across the globe, I think. So at the same time, like human trafficking and then forced labor having become more widespread. So it's a quite well known and quite popular, like in the media also, with the criminal group that exploiting the economic deprivation. Perhaps so one of the most concerning developments is the rise of the cyber scan home, where the trafficked individual are forced to labor, like the fragile operation, the targeted building, the worldwide. So that's a very important. So, but this crime don't stay with the Myanmar border. So they spill over into the neighborhood countries, so fueling the cross-border trafficking, increasing the refugee flow, and which they're undermining the regional stability. So this raises the quite critical question, and also the scholars mentioned how can neighborhood and regional country responded effectively to this growing, like security threat, especially when the Myanmar governance crisis made the cooperation more difficult. So as from the Naypyidaw to the other the headquarters also. So this our recent research also show is quite clearly, like how Myanmar has especially in the state institutions are weakened the day by day. So this is the research also. So the second topic could be about what are the major non-traditional security threat in Myanmar. So I just want to highlight that just 4 main types of the non-traditional security threats. So the first one is the human trafficking, forced labor. So it's a really soft, and also it's totally dependent on the economic deprivation has left many vulnerable to the exploitation with the trafficking network, forcing people into the scan operation and other form of the labor abuses across the country. And then the second one is about the cyber scan. Cyber scan is quite well known for the northern Chan State, and right now I think major attention on the Myanmar border. So cyber scan homes are rapidly expanding. So organized crime groups are running the large scale the scan operation from the within Myanmar and then in the border area of the Myanmar, targeting the victim not just in the region but across the world. So the third one could be about the drug trade and also illicit economy. So drug trades continue to thrive in, according to the UNODC data. So Myanmar remained the world's largest producer for their methamphetamine and fueling agitation and the crime throughout the Southeast Asia and beyond. So that's also quite important for their geopolitical issue. And then finally is a climate issue and the environmental crisis. It's also quite important. After the coup, a lot of the environmental crises are on the rise, especially the deforestation, the illegal mining, and the land grabbing are accelerating due to both the conflict and the weak governance, so displacing the community and then worsen the humanitarian crisis. So the most important thing is that each of these crimes has its own unique dynamic in the Asian Pacific region, but they all are interconnected each other, feeding off the instability and then weak state control and the weak institutional control. So all of this threaten the extended beyond the Myanmar border and creating the serious challenge for the entire region. So it could lead to the third region. So before going the third issue, so this slides show like the jade and the red are exported to China. So really, especially after like the coup So Myanmar has exported over the 170,000 tons of the red oil to China, so which is a value of 3.6 billion US dollar, and also at the same the J's, like the 7.1 billion US dollar. So this the data is reflect how like this kind of the exports are thriving in there after the coup. So the third one could be about the politicizing of the crime, the conflict setting. So this is the nature of the crime, criminality in Myanmar. So the notion that the politicization, the transnational crime, why it made the tackling these issues even more complicated than before. Like firstly, instead of being treated purely as a criminal activity. So many of these the transnational crime, such as the online scam, and framed as a political issue when we look at the northern Shan State issue and right now and the Korean issue also. So the shift this in perspective make the enforcement effort more challenging because the addressing the political concern often take the procedure over cracking down the illicit activity issue. So secondly, in Myanmar, so like the most of the armed group and the political actor have learned how to use this crime as a bargaining chip, especially with the external entity. So this leverage the illegal operation to gain the blessing and favor from the powerful external actor, especially the China. So these dynamics create a dangerous link between the crime and the political maneuvering. So that's a pretty hard like to imagine how this process and these problems are complicated. So next, crime is as a become means of the wealth accumulation. Like so for many armed groups, and then this illicit activity serves as a financial lifeline. When crime is seen as a economic necessity, so addressing it become more and more for complex. The groups that rely on this illegal operation will receive a further, like the disseminated them further entrenching the criminal network. So finally, there is a ongoing struggle between the international pressure and the local political dynamic between how to balance these two things. So while regional actors that recognize the threat posed by this crime, intervention that remain challenging due to the Myanmar fragmented governance. So the absence of the strong centralized authority makes the cross-border cooperation, and the enforcement even harder to implement, even though we are cooperating with the ERO and other, like the local actor. So when crimes are politicized, it becomes more than just loss enforcement issue. It turns into the geopolitical challenge. So addressing these problems require not only the security measure, but also the deep understanding of this political landscape, especially the local level. So this is the picture and the map of how we want to show especially for after once you took operation, most of the scan center from the northern Changsting and other area moved to the inner region of the country, especially the Mandalay and Rangoon. So and then another one is showing like even though the a lot of the operation are prepared in the Shuikoko, but we have to keep in mind that not only the Shuikoko, but also in the southern areas such as the Meto Delay and Injimia, and the rest of areas is still like the viable for the scan operation. So the last point I just want to make is a geopolitical implications. Like in this situation, so we consider that there are two key geopolitical implications. The first one is the geopolitical neglect. And the second one could be about the geopolitical competition, even though we are thinking a lot of the big power are competing over us, but not really. Unfortunately, it's not really, it doesn't make sense, like it doesn't go that way. So, but unfortunately, both have the negative consequences for Myanmar. So geopolitical neglect primarily in both the Myanmar as a neighborhood country, like if this country is a prioritize the stability of their short-term strategic interests over the long-term peace building and the governance in Myanmar. So this may end up criminalizing the Myanmar state rather than the supporting the sustainable solution to get the political solution among the group. So on the other hand, the geopolitical competition can take the form of the strategic denial and the strategic destabilization and the race for the resource extraction. So this competition can further intensify crimes by the Israeli state fragility and the creating the power vacuum and the fostering the illicit economic activity. So both the two options, geopolitical neglect and the geopolitical computation, that pose the significant challenge for the Myanmar. So especially in the current situation, I think. So addressing these risks require balanced approach. The prioritize the long-term stability, but at the same time, the prioritize the governance over the short-term interest to address this issue. So yeah, so this is the math also how we can like conceptualize how the border sorry I just the border area controlled by the resistant forces. So and for the last one, so there is a Burmese scope there at Nishi on day. So but not directly the translation, but when there's a smoke, that there's a fire. So it means we have to more focus on the root cause of the problem. So rather than the like the consequence of the problem. So thank you so much. Let me start here.
Thanks so much. And now we move to Simone.
Let me share the screen right now. So can you see my presentation? Yep. Very good morning to all of you from Asia and good evening to all of you from the West. Thank you for having me here. So like many other countries, what I'm going to share today is the implication of the USAID cut. It came so sudden and unable to apprehend what's going to happen to a war-torn country like Myanmar when the world's largest humanitarian donor pulls its support and who really pay the price. Today, I would like to share the overview of USAID cut implication with some discussion on the Thai-Myanmar border assistance and current experience and the situation of in-country operations in general. To begin, Myanmar is one of the largest, South Asia largest USAID fund recipients. The country has been facing multiple crises. The growing conflict has caused significant aid dependency by the affected population, civil society organization, community-based organization, right groups, and media. So this sudden withdrawal of this US aid will produce serious and far-reaching implication for this Thai-Myanmar border assistance as well as in-country aid operation in Myanmar. So at this very moment, as of yesterday, USAID canceled over 83% to 90% of its contract globally, and Myanmar funding for the USAID in 2025. It's expected to be around 260 million or so, and 72% is projected to go to humanitarian, healthcare, livelihood, and 19% will be for democracy, human rights, and media, and so on. So Human Rights Myanmar estimate that Myanmar to lose over 1 billion in the next 4 years during the Trump 2.0 administration. While it is still very hard to estimate the detailed implication and the magnitude of this disruption, over the past week, I have conducted a series of interviews with the ethnic stakeholders and local authorities, implementers, and civil society members on the ground. And I would like to share very, very brief preliminary assessment of this aid cuts implication in Myanmar. So the aid cuts have stopped life-saving treatments, emergency surgery, long-term medical treatment for more than 100,000 people in 9 camps in Thai-Myanmar border. Less than 10 days, stop work orders started to claim people's life in the refugee camps due to the lack of support for much needed medical supplies. Like Professor Alice Aber mentioned, one of the largest AIDS group, Border Consortium, it's claimed that it's asked for the immediate support of assistance because beyond this month, which is going to end in the next 20 days or less than 20 days, the supply of food and charcoals are at risk, not enough resources to feed the population that are entirely rely on the external source of this support, food support. And it also forces many charity NGO inside the country and also border area to stop the operation and close down the local offices straight away. And World Food Program halved the food ration for Rohingya people in the Bangladesh. And although these local authority like Bangladesh government or Thai authorities or even the different stakeholder, international community try to fill this gap, the disruption is so large and it's unable to be amended within a short period of time. So this allow me to zoom into a humanitarian situation in current state after the USAID cut, where 85% of population are IDP, internally displaced person, and one of the most vulnerable community due to the ongoing crisis as well. Based on the preliminary assessment made by the Interim Executive Council with the civil society organization, community-based organization, and community worker in the Karenni state, nearly half of the IDP population, which is about 55,000 of population, and also nearly half of the household, which is about 47% of the household in the Karenni state were affected. And 57% of the community-based organization in Karenni control area were also shut down and halt the operation. This is the assessment within the 15 days after the stop work order. In terms of the monetary value, more than 1.6 million were cut straight away. It could be more, as we go further. In in terms of monetary cut, 85% of funding cut are from humanitarian assistance, 8% from the civilian protection, 4% from the community resilience. As we can see from this map, this is a map of the Karenni control area, and 5 out of 7 townships were severely affected. These are the townships that are heavily affected, and these are the population, IDP population in those associated townships. But the impact is not just limited to this cross-border assistance. It is equally a huge blow to in-country operation, its operation inside the country. So the US contributed nearly 32% of Myanmar humanitarian response plan, making the top donor for the humanitarian sector, like Scott and Professor Ellisberg mentioned. So UNHCR, World Food Program, UNICEF Fund are the top 3 recipients of this funding. And in the recent year, there has been a wider gap between the people in need and the fund actually received on the ground. So right after the 2021 coup, people in need has increased drastically, but the funding received is not that much compared to the targeted population. This is the situation before the AIDS cut. Okay, now here the AIDS cut comes, and this funding cuts therefore create a bleak picture of in-country humanitarian operation without a doubt. So when it comes to in-country operation, access to the targeted population has been really challenging. In order to explain how difficult the access will be, I would like to use a map of this census data. Recently, the SAC has launched. So it explained the green area explained the SAC full census area, meaning that they can travel to those green area. SAC can travel to those green area, and then the light yellow color is the area under the revolutionary control, different revolutionary control of. In Kochatown presentation, we have also seen the control area in the resistant group. It's very similar to that. But the purple color are the color of the area of the mixed control area. I would like to highlight these purple area because these are the places with very much active conflict, and also these are the places where majority of the IDP exists in the country. So in terms of the humanitarian assistance, providing assistance to these SAC food control area and resistant food control area, the green and the yellow, the humanitarian organization find different way to provide assistance. However, this mixed control area is so challenging to provide assistance because multiple authority axes and conflicts are very much active. So accessing to these local population, war victim, IDPs are not really easy, as you can imagine. USAID has been traditionally known for providing assistance to those hard-to-reach areas. This reduction of US support can potentially put thousands of people out of assistance easily. And let me refer to a local report from Myanmar district, Zakai region, which is in the mixed control area around here. And it's also famous for a mixed presence of the resistant group and SAC forces. So it is estimated to have 40 organizations to stop work in this area. To be exact, in 3 townships in Monywa, Changwu, and Miao. So in around this area. The 8 program, such as Watch Child Protection for 30 villages in these 3 townships are highly impacted. One of the worst challenges is to stop the funding for the frontline worker who support the healthcare and emergency assistance to war victims within 72 hours. So this is just a brief account of what's happening on the ground. We can estimate the greater loss of the humanitarian sector as a whole. Well, definitely the AIDS card is a immediate threat to life-saving assistance, depending the current existing humanitarian crisis, exacerbate the food insecurity, or worsening the existing healthcare shortages, and so on. These will jeopardize the years of effort in defending freedoms and democratization, shrinking the CSO spaces, and so on. So we have to ask the question, is USAID too important to fill? Dismantling USAID and wider aid cuts from the EU will paralyze the Myanmar aid industry and democratization effort amid this civil war, transborder crime, political crisis, especially to withstand SAC election push. So there are 3 things to consider. Basically, many of the stakeholders are at shock and do not really know what we're gonna do. To start with, the collective action of all stakeholders required to mitigate the impact, and whatever resource we have left in our hand, reach out to the frontline supporter directly. And also it's good to always, vigilant and to reevaluate the alternative to USAID, because non-traditional non-traditional donors come with a string attached. So these are my points. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, so thanks all of you. I am going to cede my opportunity to ask questions because we have so many that are here already. So I will do my best to direct questions to the person who seems probably most germane, but feel free to jump in. But before we do that, do any of you on the panel have comments for each other or things that you realized you forgot to say that somebody else's remarks sparked? Okay, gone. All right, then we'll jump right into questions. The first one I think is probably best for Scott Marcial, which is to ask about the Burma Act, whether this will leave a legacy, whether it'll still be carried on, as much as you can say. There are questions here about like humanitarian aid. I think you pretty much addressed that. We have no idea, but how about that specifically?
Sure, I'll try. So the Burma Act was passed as law, so it's a law, unless a new legislation is passed that eliminates it or amends it. It exists as law. But the Burma Act basically authorizes aid. and this is confusing if you're, if you haven't spent a lot of time in Washington. Authorizing aid is nice. It basically means Congress is saying, hey, we think it'd be great if you sent aid to Myanmar. But the administration still has to work with Congress to get money actually appropriated. And so the Burma Act doesn't do that. So it's there. It remains. I assume it will remain as the feeling of Congress. But I don't know that the administration seems disinclined to do anything that would restore aid. Again, as my understanding is that there is a process underway to implement the funding where waivers have been provided, but I don't know how much money that is, what the timing is, how much of it would go to Myanmar. But other than that, no, I don't want to say that Burma Act doesn't matter, and probably a lot of people in Congress still support it. But you know what's happening in Washington these days, unless the Trump administration decides it wants to do this for some reason, it doesn't mean much in terms of assistance.
Thanks. This next question might be best for Simon, which is to ask about funding for Myanmar media. So I know your focus has been on the humanitarian side specifically, but you did, highlight also the distribution of aid. So this funding has supported all sorts of media in Myanmar, often from the US. So what do you see as the likely impact of this specific aspect of funding gone? And might there be an opportunity for new, more independent media? And then, or for somebody else to step in.
Okay, thank you. Actually, yeah, my presentation focused a lot on humanitarian and not so much on the democratization effort and the media in civil society. As I mentioned at the end of the presentation and of the discussion, this is also a huge blow to the media, and then to be able to stand as an independent media, this is quite a challenge, and especially I mean, in addition to this humanitarian crisis we're seeing in the Myanmar border, we have also seen that we have also heard the voice about the aid cut on the media and its immediate effect as well. This is particularly challenging because we have heard that SAC has been pushing for the election, and then this will leave this human rights violation and all these authoritarian action unchecked. So at the moment, I couldn't say what the future may hold, but yeah, we have to find a way out. Yeah, this is the thing that I can say most at the moment. Yeah.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to have more on that? No. Okay. A couple of questions here for Kocha. And I'll combine these. So first, can you expand more on how transnational organized crime networks can use their activities as bargaining chips to gain China's favor? And how do we understand when China draws a line? But then also what effect the recent crackdowns on the scam centers may have for this illegal industry? And I might add to that also, is there an implication of the drawdown in humanitarian aid and just the level of general desperation we might expect for then the proliferation of these scam centers and other transnational crime?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. So I think just if we look at the timeline of the China response to the Myanmar, especially since the coup, like what we have seen is that China tried to decouple, their interest and along with the conflict, especially the Myanmar conflict. So at the beginning, it was so far so good, but I think we just noticed that there is a kind of the argument all the time we have been raised, when the China interest with the EL interest, the progress could be quite significant or something. So that's when we look at their scan cracking down the operation, especially the northern Shan state, we see that kind of the behavior and that kind of the pattern. So that's why I thought just most of the group, especially northern group, try to use this kind of the cracking the scan centers as a bargaining chip, especially to convince the China for their operation. So this is the first one. But when it comes to the the southern border, so it could be a bit different story. But there are two main different. The first one is the location, like the geographical difference, because there is a bit far from the China border, and also it's very close with the Thai border, and also like it's a totally related to the U.S. interest, and also so that's the first one thing. And the second one is that China leverage, like the difference between the northern group and southern group is a bit different, and also like the in the southern group, the political dynamics, so they have the more or less similar military power, even though they have their like the different political stance. So they all have the quite the similar spirit, that we all are the Korean, or that kind of the kinship relationship also. So this is a bit hard to like to forward to China. So at the same time, the Thailand also have the quite complicated bureaucratic system, and also like the structure, the how to solve these problems. So different agency have the different policy regarding on this issue. So I think these also quite interconnected each other. So that's why I think we have seen in the northern group, in the northern area, like we have seen that this kind of the strategy, but in the southern we see a little bit different. So this, I think it could be the question, the answer for the first question. And the second question is the effect of the cracking down. Of course, there are a lot of the implication, especially the cracking down of the scan operation in the southern area. I think that it could be two implication. The first one could be it impact a lot on the civilian, normal ordinary civilian who are living like near this scan operation, because they totally depend on their electricity, like all of the food and services from the Thailand also. But even though they are like pushing forward this cracking down operation, but the I doubt that the scan operation don't really care about that kind of, because they can manage, like they know, like how to navigate this problem. And then, like even though we're talking about a lot of the people are transferring from this area to that area, but we have seen a lot of the another, like scenario, they are also still running in other area. They can easily, like the move from one place to another place, even in the downtown area also. So yeah, so there are a lot of the implication, but I doubt that for their scan operation centers, that's the implication for that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. This question, it's actually a pair of questions that I'll put together. Well, they are together, but I'll link them also as I present them. But I'm not sure who best to answer, so maybe a couple of you might chime in. But the first is what recommendations you would have for the National Unity Government, the NUG, or for ethnic minority organizations and local governments on how to approach the U.S. administration now. Are there narratives that seem most useful for framing the situation other than humanitarianism? And then linked with that is a question of whether the U.S. should be concerned, or how concerned it should be about China's efforts to be one of the main players in the situation. So in other words, is this part of the framing that advocates might raise, or is this something that the U.S. might encourage the U.S. to jump in some way? So who would like to take a first try? All right, Scott.
Yeah. As a former U.S. official, I'm have to be very careful to not sort of give anything that sounds like lobbying advice. So, but I'll try to address it. I mean, I'm not in Washington, so I don't have fortunately, I should say, I'm not in Washington, so I don't know all the details of who's doing what. But my sense is at this point, there is a so-called Burma caucus in Congress, people who are particularly interested, has Republicans and Democrats, I think keeping in touch with them. And then making the case. And then once more senior officials who might have oversight over Myanmar are put in place at places like the State Department and so on, engaging them. I'm not sure right now is the right time, because anyone I think who goes to Washington and says, hey, you should turn back on the foreign aid spigot, I don't think you're going to get anywhere at this point. But I think it's time to start making the case, because as I said earlier, the administration has started off in a very clear direction. That can change over time, depending on a lot of things. I don't know if it will or when it will. So it's there's no short-term answer, I guess, but continuing to talk to people who you know care, members of Congress who have a history of paying attention and being supportive, and eventually when they're in place, which should be in the next few months, I hope, senior people at places like State Department, National Security Council, and who historically have played a pretty important role in trying to think about policy. And then on China, yeah, I mean, you probably have to play the China card a little bit. I don't like doing that too much, but with some people in the administration who are very concerned about China, that may be the only entree you have. That may be the only card you have. So depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah, Alice.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Because I actually also wanted to say something about Congress. Congress is an interesting, path here, right? As Scott has just mentioned, there is a Burma caucus, this is relatively new. Actually, it's bipartisan, which is, also, notable. And, there are also other Southeast Asia caucuses, in Congress. And historically, we do see periods in which, Congress kind of leads in some areas of Southeast Asia policy. So, one question is, so I'm kind of mixed on this, right? So on the one hand, it's a possible avenue, to get attention to some important challenges, going on in Myanmar. I mean, but, on the other hand, this is a Congress that also, is pretty reluctant, I think, to spend a lot of money, for example, right? And whether or not that's going to address, right, the significant challenges in Myanmar, I think is a real outstanding question. The China angle, right? I mean, I completely agree. I think that on the one hand, one could say that China is maybe the most obvious frame, right? I mean, we know that this administration has a lot of China hawks and might find that might be receptive to it, but I'm not sure that their response is going to be a good one, right? and I'm not sure whether the response is going to actually help, right, and address all these, both the short-term challenges or the long-term challenge in terms of U.S. interests in Asia.
Right. Anyone, Simone or Chatetong, anything, or should we move on to the next question? Oh, Simone.
Yeah. It's not it's not directly to the question of what should NUG be doing. Maybe I think it's a good question for the stakeholder, local stakeholder, to rethink about the overall strategy, and it's just a wake-up call to all of the stakeholder, because as I mentioned, Myanmar has been like it has a huge aid dependency, and then the revolutionary forces, also humanitarian sector, really depend a lot on that, and it's just at the beginning of the crisis, and they may not have an answer to it, but the overall the overall thing is, I just want to mention that the self-reliance is really important at the moment. And then for those of these resistant movement people, and the supporter of the resistant movement, even, partly media, this is their moral duty. They have been doing it since '88, right? So go back to their moral duty and rely on ourselves, be a voluntary act, will not rely on the external support. And so I think it's building the self-reliance is really important. Also applied to the civil society organization inside the country. Thank you.
Great. So actually, there's a set of questions here about on whom else people of Myanmar can rely. So building on someone's call for self-reliance, I will pose some of these, but still, it's really one way of framing these is in terms of, as one of our attendees puts it, Tony Waters, the withdrawal of humanitarian assistance has created the biggest problems for Thailand and Bangladesh, which have borders and refugees. I've heard similar concerns, for instance, in Myanmar about expectations of increased refugee flows. So I'm wondering if any of you are able to say how these other countries are reacting, or if they're backfilling. That links to this sort of broader question that this guest introduces, but others as well, of are there new donors? He suggests Singapore, China, but perhaps other frontline states. But there's another question here from John Blacksland of whether there's a sympathetic ear coming from aid agencies from Europe, the UK, Japan, Australia. In other words, are there those who are other countries that are themselves affected that seem to be moving toward a new strategy? Or in addition, are there other donors you see as trying to step up to fill the gap, seeing greater urgency? So again, I'm not sure to whom to put this first.
Yeah, I can go first.
Okay,
this time.
thanks.
Yeah, actually, US has been one of the largest humanitarian donor. However, in terms of the development assistance, US is one of the top five donors, and there are other donors like Japan and EU and so on. So, I mean, to answer the first question, Singapore and China, I would say I'm not sure about Singapore because it's not in the top five donors. And basically, I think if we want to go for more neutral and with lesser string attached, it could be Japan, and rather than going for the China plus, China has a I don't think that China have a tradition of supporting the humanitarian assistance, but what they do it even in Southeast Asia, it spend more 5 times more than US, but they support more of a loan and development in terms of the development assistance they provide as a loan. It's not like, just giving you the grant and do things. But also China provide some of the assistance like educational assistance, scholarship opportunity, but this is just a friction of what US can do. So yeah, these are the options. But whether, we can rely on the West, I still have a reservation because we also hear that there is as US has been shifting policy towards more, towards look inside the country, then the other country like United Kingdom and the rest of the EU country, they will also try to build their own military base and try to cut the foreign assistance. And we've been hearing that it's possible aid cuts from the UK as well. So I'm not sure EU will be the best option to rely on. It may or may not be the US or alternative. Thank you.
Anyone else want to join on that question? Yeah, Chattanam.
I just want to highlight a bit about their Bangladesh perspective, he just mentioned about the implication, but I will more focus on the implication. Of course, the Bangladesh will, hit a point a lot of the funding card also, even though they still receiving some of the funding from their other donor also. I think each and every stakeholder will be impacted by this effect. The first one is Bangladesh has a serious problem, so they have to shoulder along this problem for a long time. So they just need to push forward, even though in their heart, especially the transition, the period, Dr. Mohammed Yunus also. But at the same time, the Arkan army has already took over a lot of the northern part of the Rakhine state also. So this problem will push forward to the Arkan army and the ULAU also, to deal this kind of the range of repatriation and other kind of issue also. And then at the same time, the election is coming. So it's a bit hard to, we concerns the post-election and then post this kind of the operation as a framing as a post-conflict setting. It's a totally different, this situations are totally different. So that's why I think these implications could be, the huge and for each and every stakeholder, especially if we look at the Bangladesh case also, even it said the Bangladesh and also Rohingya, the refugee also, and also even the ULA also. So it could lead to the many problems if we can't handle very carefully and very systematically. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'll build on that by combining another couple questions here, which have to do with the effects for the ethnic armed organizations, the People's Defense Forces, and so forth. Do you see any likelihood, this is probably a question mostly for Chattanam, about the balance of forces amongst them as a result of these cuts, or the shift in U.S. policy and likely, Western support broadly?
Yeah, actually, but it's a bit hard to say, like what kind of the UN assistant go to the PDM and others, because as far as we know, like Burma as a non-leader assistant, so it's mostly, like non-military and other kind of assistance. So it's a bit more or less, like quite similar and quite hard to say that. So I think, but it totally, it totally has the implication, especially even in the resistance movement, and also because a lot of the movement and then other kind of the mechanical things are driven by this kind of the funding also. So I think, yeah, I would say the more or less impact on this issue. And then, yeah, sorry, I think I could the answer later on another question also. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Then next question, then I'll put to, I think probably Scott, maybe Alice, which is, what do you think the junta's growing ties with Russia, especially in military and nuclear areas, means for the US's approach to the situation? Is that what will wake up the US?
It should, but given President Trump's seeming affinity for Vladimir Putin and Russia, I'm not sure it will. I mean, I think it's hard for people to understand just how dramatically things have changed here, at least with the current administration. I don't know that it reflects the view of most Americans or even most members of Congress, but it's the current reality. So yeah, I'll stick to my original answer. It should, but not for the moment, given where President Trump seems to be.
Anyone else? Alice?
What do you-
All right. Simone, I'm just looking at this was a question directed specifically to you. So, and you've addressed it in part, but it's obviously the USAID cut is a big blow for the people of Myanmar. But what about the resilience, which you mentioned, and local governance efforts by emerging actors in Myanmar? So, are there any hopeful thoughts? And maybe since you've talked about resilience broadly, do you see initiatives at the local level? You mentioned data, for instance, from the Karenni communities and so forth. Are there areas that seem to be doing a better job, for instance, of finding ways to regroup or to build local resilience?
Thank you. I have also asked a few, I've also talked to a few people on the ground in terms of the local resiliency, not only the ethnic control area and also in the famine area as well in dry zone. Basically, like I mentioned, people have all that kind of moral upbringing that we have to do it no matter what, because this is our spirit. We have to fight for it and we have to go through it no matter what, right? That we have a moral cause for it. However, in order to how far this the current spirit of resiliency will last for, and how far we can go, we don't know yet, because obviously it concerns with people's life and life-saving system as well. And as far as I understand, been talking to various local groups and community inside the country, they are finding a very innovative way to support on their own. For instance, this of the wedding present go to that charity, and this go to that organization, and so on. These they have a kind of a creative method to do the funding support, but I'm not sure it will be large enough to sustain what's that ongoing support that has been made before. And I mean, also that's another part that, I mean, what it's a possible outcome from this US cuts in USAID cut in the long run, right? My own concern is that it could lead to what Gu Zhou worry in his presentation. He mentioned that there is a potential for not only potential, they already happened, that the climate change or environmental degrading impact. Myanmar is in conflict and climate change, the crisis is in the nexus, and it's a vicious cycle basically. So, you know, if we don't have aids, we don't have aids for humanitarian support, then what can we do? Maybe, you know, for some of the local authority, they may raise tax, although they very much understand that these people already bear the burden of this, you know, problem. One of the option is in long run to raise tax, and we are already suffering multiple taxation burden in local community as well. And then the second, the second thing, the possibility is that you know, resource extraction of the local authority. Although, you know, they may try their best to find an alternative to US aid cut, but my worry is that there may be the, you know, more resource extraction activity likely to follow. Yeah, and yeah, the future is not really good, basically.
This is not our most uplifting webinar ever. All right, one final question. I think this is really for Chotet and Scott. And here's one more, so I'll just mention this one as well. Before I give you each 30 seconds to wrap up, but that is, what are the possibilities for addressing the issues of transnational crime? You mentioned Chotet Ong, and is there any possibility that that's what will rope in the US? And then this last question I will just mention, and then if anybody wants to try to address, because it's a good one, how best to protect political prisoners and vulnerable populations under this current landscape. Are there things that members of the diaspora can do, or that members of this audience might be able to do? So let's start with Chotet Ong, then Scott, and then maybe Alice and Simon, if you want to jump in, and then wrap in your final remarks in this round, please.
Thank you. So I think I hate to say, but there's no silver bullet, you know, like to hit all of this problem to solve. So, but you know, when we talk about the transnational crimes and other the TOC and the non-traditional security, that we all talk about the, you know, like crimes and conflict nexus. So this is the very common sense, you know, if there's a conflict, so it's a weak stable and there's still no stability and the weak governance. So that's why it's a place to thrive there for their transnational crime. But there's another perspective, is, you know, that if we look at the Myanmar history, especially the 1988, a lot of some groups that make the ceasefire, bilateral ceasefire with at the time the SLODC or other kind of thing. But if we look at this kind of the crime, so they need some kind of more or less stability. There's no conflict in that area, especially, you know, like the rest area are, you know, like the happening a lot of the conflict. But so that's why we have to be, you know, careful. Some of the you know, like bilateral ceasefire could be happening in the future. So that's you know, like the important point to, you know, note that. So we have to avoid, because these crimes are result of the previous, you know, like the ceasefire, especially the bilateral ceasefire. Because for the short term, you know, like the military objective and political objective are really important. But for the medium and long term, you know, like how to accumulate wealth and how to accumulate power and how to exchange these two things are really important for their, you know, resistant forces, especially for the ERO. So that's why the accumulation of wealth is really important for this group, you know, to carry on their operation or something. So that's why we have to be careful about the you know, like the some of the bilateral ceasefire. It could lead to another, you know, unnecessary problem for the future. That's a very important thing. I think I just want to highlight in this point.
Yeah, I certainly agree with the concern about bilateral ceasefires for that reason and for others. In terms of addressing the transnational crime problem, I mean, I do think this is, you know, ASEAN is the one group that has the ability to convene or invite other powers, including the United States and China, Japan, others, Australia, etc., because this is a global problem. There are victims globally. To try to work on this issue. Obviously, there's no easy fixes or magic silver bullet, as Choten Ong said. So I would hope that, you know, Malaysia as ASEAN chair, perhaps, could suggest, you know, starting with a meeting. I mean, I know these meetings don't really solve problems immediately, but to try to mobilize and see if they can get a group to work together to try to tackle some of these problems. Although as long as you have parts of Myanmar, and not only Myanmar, but particularly Myanmar, that are either ungoverned or sort of ruled by, semi-criminal elements or border guard force that are working with the criminal elements, it's pretty hard to solve the problem. As for wrapping up, I guess the only thing I can say is that I don't see much short-term opportunity to get the U.S. to re-engage in a serious way or restart assistance. But as I mentioned before, administration comes out charging hard one way. It may just continue down that path, but it's also very possible that over time it adjusts based on confronting the realities of the world. And so the engagement, the conversations need to continue. And telling people who are in the middle of a crisis to be patient is horrible, but I don't have any better advice than that.
Simone or Alice?
Yeah. Just to wrap up, I would like to echo what the other the panelists have mentioned. In the short term, it's people's life and livelihood in both inside their country and on cross-border operation, and also in the medium and long-term implication, it's a setback for this hard work for democracy. And even though USAID may come, but in the next year, and maybe it's not very easy to roll out the humanitarian assistance plan and also development plan and as we used to have it before. So, but to answer this, there's no magic, and the situation is quite urgent, we all know, and without international cooperation and sustained effort of the stakeholder, this will not be solved easily. Thank you.
I'll just add, I guess, a few, additional points building on what others have said. I think it's nobody wants to end on a terribly pessimistic note, but I do think that, there's so many challenges, right? To the question about, what other actors can respond. These are all kind of reactive things that we're looking at a very tough time for all actors, right? If we look at, European actors, especially, right? I mean, they're upping their defense spending now, right? There's going to be cuts somewhere. And so, the expectation right now is that these will also, humanitarian and aid and assistance, those areas will also be cut to make up for some of that increased spending. This said, I think as Suman had mentioned earlier, I mean, people are resourceful, right? I mean, within Myanmar, they're resourceful. And so, there's that, but ultimately, right, the question is, how is this political situation, going to be addressed, right? And that's unfortunately something, that's, very much playing out on the ground, and it's not clear how that's going to come out. My just final last point, since Scott mentioned ASEAN, and ASEAN is kind of the organization that, everyone likes to critique, but there is, I think the Malaysian chairmanship may very well be an opportunity, right? I mean, the Malaysia is one of the more, capable chairs in ASEAN. I think it is motivated. It sees its own experience, right, with federalism, for example, as something that, that also kind of motivates itself, right? I mean, in terms of engaging the Myanmar question. And so, one question was, what will it do with that chairmanship? So I just thought I'd add that piece of it.
Thanks. So I appreciate immensely from all four of you your substance and your insight of your remarks. I'm sorry that we're all in this position of needing this conversation. I'm glad there's been at least some effort to see where there might be possible ways forward, but it is indeed both a dramatic political situation that is no better than it was before the current U.S. administration came in, just on Myanmar's part in terms of just the intractability of the situation there, but now so much worse a humanitarian situation than there was before, and it was already bad. So on that pessimistic note, but hoping that at least we can leave better informed, if not better equipped, actually to change the situation. Thanks to all four of you for participating. Thanks to everyone who is watching this, either right now or later. And let's hope for a better rest of the year ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.